Referred to the brutality of the violence committed on these innocent civilians and said the international sports community should stand united in condemning these atrocities and should play its part to ensure accountability. The statement from the Council also said that the killings of numerous professionals in the field and the destruction and looting of sports centers has forced all sports activities to stop. Sablor Glama has the details.
Tigray Sport Council issued a statement on Thursday condemning the extrajudicial killing of Tigrayans in Benishangul Gumuz. A recently surfaced video showing Ethiopian forces and regional allies from Amhara and southern nations and nationalities burning the corpse of Tigrayan civilians extrajudicially murdered by these forces, as one is seen trying to escape the fire.
We executive committee members of Tigray Sport Council, we are here to be the voice of innocent Tigrayans, civilians who are killed, slaughtered, and burned in life recently in Benishangul Gumuz.
They also condemned Ethiopian Sport Commission and prominent Ethiopian athletes for failing to condemn the atrocities and said some had played a part in inciting or justifying violence against Tigrayans.
Furthermore, some famous Ethiopian athletes such as Haile Gebrselassie and Gazei Abarra are supporting the war by motivating the youth to join the injustice war, which is totally unaccepted by the principle of sport. Meanwhile, when those all things have happened, the Ethiopian Sport Commission had never condemned the evil acts which are out of international sport principles.
The statement also added that mass killings and wanton destructions of private and public properties, compounded by the ongoing siege on the region, has had a devastating impact on ordinary Tigrayans.
Since 3 November 2020, all-rounded invasions has taken place in Tigray by the Ethiopian Defense Forces, cooperation with Eritrean invading force, Amhara militia Fano, and the external forces, horrific killing of civilians, destructions of historical and religious heritages, looting, raping, burning people alive, siege, etc. Our people are suffering by humanitarian blockage such as lack of medicine, food, vaccination, and blockage of basic infrastructure such as electricity, water supply, telecommunication, bank service, and so on.
The Sports Council also stated the toll of the conflict on Tigray's sport community, saying many athletes have been killed and sports centers destroyed and looted.
This all impacts also severely affect and entirely damage sport in Tigray. Many sport men and women, coaches were killed, heavy destructions occurred in sport center. A lot of sport machine and utilities were damaged and looted. Almost all stadiums of Tigray were heavily ruined, as the invaders used them as military camps. For example, in Tigray International Stadium, a lot of modern and standard machines and materials were looted and damaged.
Finally, the Council called on the international sport community to take a decisive action to compel the Ethiopian government in ending the siege on Tigray.
At last, Executive Committee member of Tigray Sport Council calls for international sports community to stop genocide and force that Ethiopian government to solve the problem peacefully.
In a related news, religious leaders issued a statement on Wednesday condemning the extrajudicial killing of Tigrayan civilians in Benishangul Gumuz. The religious leaders said religious leaders in Ethiopia had played a role in not only justifying the violence but inciting it, and said all parties must be held accountable. Amani Lamara has the report.
Religious leaders issued a joint statement on Wednesday, condemning the most recent attack on Tigrayans in Benishangul Gumuz that has resulted in the deaths of dozens of Tigrayans. The 8-month-long occupation of Tigray by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces was characterized by its large toll on civilians and civilian infrastructure, including massacres, torture, and the use of rape and famine as a weapon of war. A recently surfaced video has shown that, while these forces have left much of Tigray, they have continued to commit unspeakable atrocities on Tigrayans living in other parts of Ethiopia. The video shows Ethiopian forces burning the bodies of murdered Tigrayans, as one of the innocent civilians is seen trying to escape the fire, while Ethiopian forces continue through ethnic slurs.
The Lord says that we should love our brothers and friends like we do to ourselves. This barbaric act is inhumane and unbecoming of the values of Christianity. Our church is praying to God to give them the heart to confess their crimes.
People were killed and burned simply because they were Tigrayans. On behalf of Islamic Affairs, I would like to express our sorrow regarding what has unfolded in Benishangul Gumuz. Really, it's inhuman.
The religious leaders said that Ethiopian officials and religious leaders have played an essential part by using dehumanizing terms that have perpetuated violence against Tigrayans or served to justify them.
What does Tigrayans should perish mean? What is the crime of the people of Tigray? They are intending to commit genocide against the people of Tigray. The people are resisting and praying a sacrifice. What other option do they have? Where can they go?
What we are saying now is a result of years of hate speech against Tigrayans. They wish to eliminate Tigrayans not only physically, but also from the memory.
The religious leaders called on the international community, especially religious leaders across the world and human rights organizations, to ensure that justice is served in the ongoing conflict in Tigray.
We pray to God to inspire the world leaders to take action.
The siege on Tigray must end. It's against international law and we are part of the world, and our suffering deserves attention.
The video is just the latest of many to come out, demonstrating unspeakable atrocities committed on Tigrayans. But the question remains to be if these forces will be held accountable for their crimes.
Tigray Human Rights Advocacy Network, a consortium of human rights organizations, issued a statement on Wednesday saying inaction on the part of global governance body has allowed Ethiopian forces to continue to commit atrocities against Tigrayans with impunity. The statement was issued after a video showing Ethiopian national forces, as well as regional forces from Amhara and southern nations and nationalities burning the corpse of Tigrayan civilians extrajudicially murdered by these forces and burning one other civilian alive. The network emphasized that 30 innocent Tigrayans had so far been confirmed to have been killed in Matakkal alone, and that more needed to be done to ensure the right to life of innocent Tigrayans living across Ethiopia. Saying UN Security Council and the UN's Higher Commission for the Human Rights has to put pressure on Ethiopian government to abide by the international humanitarian law and protect Tigrayans from life-threatening harm that jeopardizes their rights for life, ensure that international bodies are able to conduct an independent investigation into atrocities, and put pressure on all parties to the conflict in Ethiopia to demonstrate their responsibility to safeguard the safety and security of citizens and citizen groups. Director for the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Adhanom, called the humanitarian catastrophe in Tigray the worst health crisis in the world, but said it had been forgotten by the world and it was not receiving much the attention it to deserve. The Director General said that just 1% of the much-needed medical supplies had reached the region in the past few weeks, and that the World Health Organization was awaiting approval for the Ethiopian government to deliver some 90 metric tons of medical aid into the region. Sarun Tsagay has more on this.
On a media briefing on Wednesday, the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Adhanom, asked that the world not forget the conflict in Tigray that has put millions in crisis, with no food aid being allowed to enter the region since mid-December of 2021.
And in Ethiopia, 6 million people in Tigray have been under blockade by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces for almost 500 days, sealed off from the outside world. There is almost no fuel, no cash, and no communications. No food aid has been delivered since the middle of December. 83% of the population is food insecure.
The WHO estimates that some 2,200 metric tons of medical supplies is needed to respond to the medical emergency on the ground. Less than 1% of this has so far been able to reach Tigray, leaving close to 4 million people in crisis.
People are dying. There is no treatment for 46,000 people who need treatment for HIV. And the program has been abandoned. People with tuberculosis, hypertension, diabetes, and cancer are also not being treated and may have died. As a result of the lack of fuel, some of our partners are having to scale back their operations. The situation in Tigray is catastrophic.
The Director General referred to the crisis in Tigray as the forgotten crisis, while emphasizing that it is in fact one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes in the world.
The situation in Tigray is catastrophic. The blockade on communications, including on journalists being able to report from Tigray, means it remains a forgotten crisis, out of sight and out of mind. Yes, I'm from Tigray, and this crisis affects me, my family, and my friends very personally. But as the Director General of WHO, I have a duty to protect and promote health wherever it's under threat. And there is nowhere on earth where the health of millions of people is more under threat than in Tigray.
Lastly, the Director General called on the governments of Ethiopia and Eritrea to end the siege and allow unfettered humanitarian access to aid workers so that they can save lives, and cautioned that health systems should never be target of a conflict or part of a strategy of a war.
Researchers at Ghent University, estimating mortality since the start of the conflict in Tigray in 2020, say that close to 500,000 people may have lost their lives due to mass killings, starvation, and lack of access to medical care. The researchers say the study is so far from comprehensive due primarily to the communications blackout on the region that has made it impossible to track the situation on the ground. Sara Kalali reports.
A study by Ghent University's John Nason and Tim van den Bemt has estimated that some 500,000 people may have lost their lives due to issues related to the conflict since its start in November of 2020. The researchers say anywhere from 150,000 to 200,000 people may have lost their lives due to starvation, while between 50,000 to 100,000 were victims of mass killings, with more than 100,000 having died due to lack of medical care. While the communication blackout and deliberate obstruction of aid into the region has made it impossible to determine the toll of the conflict on civilians, the sheer mass of recorded incident of mass killings and the destruction of public and private property had made it clear that the toll was catastrophic. According to the research, the figure on starvation deaths are based on IPC, Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, and figure from USAID published in 2021, and stated that these figures are probably much worse now as the blockade continues to worsen the situation in Tigray, emphasizing that a study by the World Food Programme showed that the harvest from past year would be exhausted by April of 2022, and said that if the blockade on the region should continue, well over 50% of the population may be left without access to food. The number of deaths due to lack of health care are based on excess mortality data by the World Bank that shows that an average of 6 people out of 1,000 die under normal circumstances, but that number had spiked to 20 deaths with the start of the conflict in November of 2020 and 32 deaths since the start of the siege in June of 2021. The research also emphasized that not only was the Ethiopian government maintaining a hold on all forms of communication in and out of the region, but had not been allowing UN personnel to carry necessary documents in and out of Tigray, resulting in the underreporting of mortality in Tigray.
Close to 20% of HIV-positive patients in Tigray receive treatment at Mala Hospital. That has now been without essential medical supplies for months, endangering the lives of countless mothers and children. Aragawi Garumkail has the report.
Mekelle General Hospital is one of the largest and oldest hospitals in Tigray, providing care to tens of thousands of patients every year. Mekelle Hospital also cares for a great deal of patients suffering from chronic illnesses, including almost 20% of HIV-positive patients in the state. Ava Gabriel was diagnosed HIV positive over a decade ago, but had been living a normal life until the start of the conflict in 2020 that has deliberately targeted health facilities and their capacity to provide care.
Life is very difficult these days. There are days where I go without anything to eat. Not just that, but we've also been denied access to medication in this modern day. I don't know what can be said. I'm losing weight uncontrollably.
A deliberate and systematic attack on health facilities across the state has incapacitated Tigray's health system, leaving people like Ababa vulnerable. Sarkan Abraha is a mother of two. She has been receiving treatment for over 2 decades now, but has been forced to stop due to the blockade that has depleted medical supplies in the region.
I started to feel weak when I realized there was no medication available. I started to feel pain in my legs. I don't know if it's stress or if it's the illness. I've never felt this kind of pain, but the very thought of lacking medication causes me pain. I feel anxiety coming up.
Sister Hiot Aragawi, the coordinator at the ART Center at Mekelle Hospital, says lack of medical supplies may lead to the center to close soon, devastating mothers and children.
መድኃኒት የለን ኣብቲ ሆስፒታል ክረአ ከሎ በሆስፒታል ደረጃ ይኹን ብትግራይ ደረጃ ምንም ዓይነት መድኃኒት የለ ዝኸዝእዋን.
There is no medication in this hospital or in Tigray. Our biggest concern now is for mothers and children that used to receive care here. Mekelle Hospital used to provide care for 5,000 HIV patients, but depletion of medical supplies at the hospital has meant that these patients are forced to go without medication.
Dr. Philemon Masfin, Chief Executive Officer at Mekelle Hospital, says he believes a spike in HIV-positive cases may have been resulted from the use of rape as a weapon of war by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces during their brief occupation of the region.
We have thousands, maybe more, girls who were raped by the Eritrean and Ethiopian soldiers, which we witnessed they were positive for the HIV. So on top of that, currently they are blocking everything that we used to get. So they raped our sisters and mothers, and currently they are not giving us even the medications.
But despite the increased risk for the spread of the virus in Tigray and the right of patients to receive treatment, medical supplies essential for treating HIV-positive patients is just one of the many the Ethiopian government has been blocking.
We have more than 43,000 HIV patients. Can you imagine? Still, we didn't get any drug for HIV patients. We are using the lucky health facilities are using expired drugs to treat their patients, the HIV patients.
We've run out of medical supplies, so we're not able to treat newly infected patients. We don't even have medication for patients we've been treating for years. The issue here is that we have a lot of new cases and no medication.
Normally in HIV patients, the principle is test and treat. If the patient test is positive, you have to treat him or her. Currently, we are back to the way we used to treat before about 3 years or 4 years, which was you just test, and even though he or she is positive, you just do the CD4 count and viral load, and there were criteria to treat or to wait for some time. That was an outdated, an obsolete regime by this time.
Ababa is calling on the international community and concerned bodies to play their part to ensure that the millions in their need of medical attention are able to get it.
Does the world consider us to be human beings? I don't know why the world hasn't acted yet. We're suffering due to lack of basics such as food and medication in this so-called modern day. The message I have for the world is to please do what they can to help us. We are dying. Many are dying each day.
The 60-month-long war on Tigray has had a devastating cost on civilians who have deliberately been targeted for mass killings and rape, as public institutions have been the targets of deliberate and systematic destruction.
For 8 months, a comprehensive siege that has discontinued all basic services into the region, including telecommunication, banking services, has taken millions into the brink. Gawrat Khala, his wife, and their 7 children used to live a stable and happy life with their income primarily dependent on taxi owned by the family. Today, a blockade on fuel and other essential services has meant Gawrat Khala's family, like many others, is facing an uncertain future. Salome Takhlai has more.
Gawrat Khala is the head of a household of 9 that primarily depends on income from Gawrat Khal's taxi, which he has owned for years now. He says him and his family lived a stable and a happy life before the start of the conflict in 2020. Today, him and his family find themselves in crisis due to the all-encompassing siege on Tigray that has blocked off all basic supplies coming into the region, including fuel.
I have 7 children. This is in addition to me and my wife. So in total, there is 9 of us and we live in a rented house. Before the war, paying for these things was not a problem. We even had income for other expenditures. But now, let alone plan for a better future and buy clothes and shoes for our children, we are no longer able to put meals on the table for our children. We don't know when our next meal is coming from.
Gawrat Khala says the deliberate blockade on goods and especially essential services, such as banking, has had a devastating impact on households such as Gawrat Khla's.
People who previously led a steady life and had a good job are the ones that are starving now. The closing of banks, especially, people are starving, even though they have money in their bank accounts. This is true for me as well. The closing of banks and other blockade has caused a crisis. The international community needs to see what is happening in Tigray. They are using starvation as a silent weapon of war. They need to pay attention to the people and put an end to this.
Data from the Office for Early Warning indicates that there are over 6.5 million people in dire need of humanitarian assistance in Tigray, whose conditions are continuing to deteriorate due to the ongoing siege.
17 months into the conflict, the Ethiopian government has refused to establish a safe and dependable route for aid agencies to deliver much-needed aid into Tigray. The blockade on humanitarian aid, a devastating siege that has discontinued all basic services and lack of medical supplies, have devastated over 6.5 million people in dire need of humanitarian assistance. Wintakidana has the details.
The man-made humanitarian catastrophe in Tigray is well on its way to being one of the worst of the 21st century. Earlier this month, Office for Early Warning and Emergency Response announced that there are well over 6.5 million people in Tigray in dire need of humanitarian assistance.
Data from our office indicates that there are now 6.53 people in urgent need of food assistance.
The humanitarian catastrophe is a result of Ethiopian and Eritrean troops' deliberate and systematic destruction or looting of agricultural produces, agricultural implements, and water irrigation schemes across the state, not to mention the looting and slaughter of livestock. Smallholder farmers have been the primary targets of the war, in addition to the systematic destruction of their personal wells, schools, and health facilities in rural communities were deliberately targeted and destroyed. The physical damage on public institutions across the state was followed by a blanket suspension of public services. At the end of June, when Tigrayan forces were able to repel Ethiopian and Eritrean forces from much of Tigray, including the capital, the Ethiopian government would impose an all-encompassing siege on Tigray, discontinuing all essential services into the region, including telecommunication, power supply, and banking, not to mention a blockade on food aid and basic supplies coming into the region. The siege on Tigray has been effective, with just 6% of necessary aid reaching Tigray since June of 2021.
حزون ካብ ሰነ ክሻብ ታሕሳስ 7 ትዝኣተ ዝነበረ ረድኤት ትሕት 7 ሚእታዊ
Less than 7% of much-needed aid has reached Tigray between June and December 2021.
But even before the start of the siege on the region in late June, humanitarian workers had very limited access within the region.
due primarily to the Ethiopian government's refusal to establish a humanitarian corridor. A humanitarian corridor is a temporary demilitarized zone to allow the safe passage of humanitarian aid as well as refugees out of a crisis region. Humanitarian corridors have been put in place since the mid-20th century and have served to ensure safe access to humanitarian workers and refugees in many places, including in Bosnia during the 3-year-long Sarajevo siege. Since the start of the conflict in Tigray, however, the Ethiopian government has refused to establish any safe access into Tigray, allowing regional forces to obstruct humanitarian work with impunity. There are at least 11 access points into Tigray, all of which have been closed with the cooperation by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces. Tigray is located in northernmost Ethiopia, bordering Eritrea to the north, Sudan to the west, Amhara to the southwest, and the Afar region to the east and southeast, giving Tigray 11 access points. Humanitarian aid can reach Tigray through a land route from Addis Ababa through Dasse, Lalibela, and the Amhara region, and reach Mekelle through Yechila in southeastern Tigray. But this route, just like 4 others that either originate or pass through the Amhara region, have been blocked by the Amhara region forces, including a route from Bahar Dar through Debark that can reach Shire through western Tigray, and another route that can travel through Gondar into Maikadra and Shire. Another route can go through Bahar Dar and Gondar into Dansha and Shire. But this is not the only route where Amhara forces are blocking humanitarian aid from reaching Tigray. Amhara forces in western Tigray have not only taken part in an ethnic cleansing campaign, killing, torturing, and displacing millions, but have also taken part in hindering aid intended to reach Tigrayans through the area, blocking 2 possible aid routes from Sudan, including an essential aid route from the port of Sudan that could move through Maikadra, Humera in western Tigray, and then Shire, and another route through Tasenne, both blocked by Amhara militia and allies from Eritrea. But the presence of these forces in western Tigray is not only aimed at blocking aid routes, but has also been closed off for any movement, with the Ethiopian government breaching international rules on the conduct of war by blocking Tigrayans attempting to seek refuge in Sudan.
This is really the only safe place for many Tigrayans, and the Ethiopian forces, Ethiopian allied forces, Ethiopian government forces, we're told, are blocking that. That's a war crime. Blocking safe passage to fleeing communities would meet the metrics, the guidelines for a war crime.
The remaining routes travel through Afar regional state but originate from Djibouti or Addis Ababa. These routes have been blocked off for much of the conflict, with no aid being allowed through this route since mid-December.
In the first place, by the way, it's not the only route we have to Mekelle or to Tigray, by the way. We have more than 10 alternative routes. If you want to come to Mekelle or to Tigray, there are options, different options. They are doing it intentionally, by the way.
But the blockade on goods traveling through the Amhara region had started long before conflict erupted in November of 2020. Right-wing media ISAT, for example, had been calling for the blockade on Tigray for well over half a decade.
አንደኛም በአማራ ክልል የምንገኝ ኢትዮጵያውያን ከትግራይ በደሴ ወደ አዲስ አበባ፣ ሁለተኛም ከወልዲያ ወረታም፣ ከሽሬ ጎንደር፣ ከሁመራ ጎንደር፣ ከመተማ ጎንደር ያሉ መንገዶችን በድንጋይ በእንጨት መተላለፊያውን በመዝጋት የአፋር ወገኖቻችን ከትግራይ መቀሌ ከዊሃ በሸሂድ አፍዴራም አሳይታ የሚወስደውን በጠቅላላ በመውጣት በድንጋይ በእንጨት መተላለፊያውን በመዝጋት
Once extreme right-wing propaganda, it's been over 3 years now since Ethiopian government officials have started to take talking points from the media outlet. Now high-level officials, including ministers, are seen expressing similar sentiment. Former Minister for Economic Affairs, Minister Melaku Al-Lebel, is seen justifying the almost 2-year-long blockade on Tigray by Amhara vigilante group Fano almost a year before the start of the conflict.
የምትቃወሟቸውን አካላት መቃወማችሁን ስትገልጹ የምታሄሱበት የምትጠቀሙበት ቋንቋ ህዝብና ህዝብን ልብ ለልብ ሊያሻክር በሚችል መንገድ በተዘዋሪ መንገድ ነካ አርጎ አልፎ የሆነ ውጤት ምክንያቱም እያየን ስለሆነ
እኔ በችግሩ ከተገለጸበት ቋንቋ በላይ የተፈጠረው ችግር ገዝፎ ከብዶ ይታየኛል። በዚህ ሀገር ላይ ያልተገባ ኢሰባዊ ድርጊቶች ተፈጽመዋል። ይሄን ድርጊት አለመናገር፣ አለማውገዝ እና አለመታገል ነው ወንጀል የሚሆነው እንጂ በየትኛውም ቋንቋ ይሄ ድርጊት ቢገለጽ እኔ የሚያንስ ካልሆነ በስተቀር የሚበዛ መስሎ አይታየኝም።
አዴፓ እንደ አዴፓ አይደለ መንገድ ሲዘጋ የነበረው ወደ ትግራይ ክልል የሚያልፍ ንብረት እኮ እንዲቋረጥ ያደረገው ይሄ ህዝብ የመረረ ጥላቻ ለዛኛው ህዝብ ስላሳደረ ነው። ምክንያቱም የተጫኑት ንብረቶች ወይም የምግብም ይሁን የመጠጥ ሸቀጣ ሸቀጦች ተጭነው የሚሄዱት ለህወሓት አይደለም፣ ለትግራይ ህዝብ ነው። ለትግራይ ህዝብ የሚሄድን ንብረት እዚህ መንገድ ላይ አቋርጦ ማስቀረት የቻለ ህዝብ የመረረ ጥላቻ ያለው መሆኑን ያሳያል። እንዲያደርግ ደግሞ እናንተ ህወሓት ላይ ያላችሁን ተቃውሞ ወይም ቀደም ሲል ጥፋተኞች ላይ የምታስተላልፏቸው መልእክቶች ህብረተሰባችሁን ለበለጠ የልብ መሻከር በሚያስችል መንገድ ነው።
የመጀመሪያው ነገር እኔ መግባባት ላይ መድረስ መቻል ያለብን አዴፓ ሌባን ኢሰባዊ ድርጊት የሚፈጽምን ዘራፊን ኃይል የሚደብቅ ከሆነ 10 ሰዎች ይሁን 15 ሰዎችም ይሁን መጠለያቸው አዴፓ እስከሆነ ድረስ አዴፓ መወገዝ አለበት። አዴፓን ሸፍኖ የሚይዝ የአማራ ክልል አዴፓ ወንጀለኛ ሆኖ አዴፓ ጥፋተኛ ሆኖ አዴፓን አቅፎ የሚይዝና የሚከላከል የአማራ ህዝብ ካለ የአማራ ህዝብ መወገዙ የሚቀር አይመስለኝም። በተመሳሳይ ሁኔታ በትግራይም በዛ መንገድ ነው መታየት መቻል ያለበት።
President of Afar Regional State Awal Arba has gone on national television multiple times to say that regional authorities will not allow access into Tigray and considers the hindered of humanitarian aid into Tigray an important tactical force. People not taking part in hostilities have a right to humanitarian assistance. This right flows from the international humanitarian law as well as international human rights law, including the right to food and water in case of natural or other disasters. States have the responsibility to ensure this right, but where a party is not just unable but actively obstructionist, working to willfully impede the passage of relief supplies, these actions may be held as war crimes under the Rome Statute. The Ethiopian government has made it clear that it is not willing to allow humanitarian aid into Tigray by blocking not 1 or 2 access points into Tigray but 11. The question remains to be if and when the Ethiopian government will be held accountable for its actions.
That concludes our news for the hour.